Greetings and welcome to an irradiated and mutated, supersized episode of Genre Grinder. Joining me today is perennial co-host and co-host of 96 Greers, Patrick Rapol. Pratfall Rapol,
that's what they called me.
Reintroduce yourself to the people who somehow don't know who you are yet.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've been on a lot of episodes of Genre Grinder. Before that, I was a host of a podcast called Tracks of the Damned, where I did commentary tracks on horror films, the very first episode of which is on a movie we will be talking about today. I am the co-host, as Gabe said, of 96 Greers, which is a podcast where we tackle every single film with Judy Greer in the cast. Every feature film, I should say, with Judy Greer in the cast. I've hosted a music podcast called Uptown Song Club. I used to be the host of Directors Club podcast. And, I have a life outside of podcasting. You wouldn't know about it.
Yeah. I mean, I know you for years, and I don't know about it, so.
Right. I read books occasionally, that sort of thing.
Weird. All right, so this is our we're trying to make this a tradition. This is our big annual multi-part episode where we try to look at a specific year when a specific genre peaked. And we first did this didn't have in mind that we'd do it multiple times, but we first did this. We covered all the slasher movies of the year 1981. And then we did an episode about international horror in the year 1960. Mm-hmm. And then most recently we did the Giallo movies of 1971.
That's right.
So it really felt like it was Patrick's turn to pick. So he told me that the giant monster movies, in America in particular, but worldwide too, peaked in the year 1957. And so without going too much into detail, because we're going to be covering these movies, and we'll probably be covering it for at least 3 to 6 hours in the end, depending. This is going to be a part one. Hopefully this will be part one of two, but we'll see what happens. But could you kind of run us through why 1957 was such a peak year for giant monsters?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, I want to say, this is something, I don't know if this is something other people have observed or written about or whatever, but this is something I figured out when I was doing research for the first episode of Tracks of the Damned, because I was doing a commentary track on The Giant Claw, which is a monster movie we will be talking about. It was very funny and very strange, and I was trying to sort of place it and give it context in terms of the genre of the giant monsters attack kind of a movie. And when I was doing my research, I realized that, 1957 was a year that a ton of them came out, and then 1958 was a year that very few of them came out, and then even less came out in 1959, and then by the time you get to 1960, we have sort of if you think about horror moving in eras and cycles, I think that the 50s and post-World War II, a lot of horror went away from the Gothic tradition established by the Universal horror films of the 30s and 40s. And in the 50s, they went into the sci-fi tradition of movies like Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and Godzilla and Them. It came from outer space. A lot of body snatcher movies were made in the 50s that you've covered on a previous episode of Genre Grinder. And then once you get to the late 50s, 1959 to the early 60s, 1960, that's when you get sort of this Gothic revival with the Hammer films. You get Roger Corman's, Edgar Allan Poe films, which were very big. You get Mario Bava doing a lot of Gothic horror in the early 60s. And things sort of went back to signifiers that you more associate with the horror genre as opposed to the sci-fi genre. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons, and it has been, commented on by everybody in terms of why were people afraid of giant monsters in the 50s. And, part of that was, people had anxiety about the Cold War and about people using atomic weapons. And, these giant monsters are not exclusively, but frequently the results of radiation, mutation, that sort of thing. During the Cold War, giant monsters and alien invaders both made really neat stand-ins for the Soviets, because the thing about a Cold War is you can't really make a Cold War movie. It has to be that would have to be a spy movie or whatever, which those came about more in the 60s than the 50s. But you have these, alien invaders and Earth versus the Flying Saucers, or we're going to be talking about Kronos. To me, that is a very giant monster as sort of Soviet faceless thing, kind of a movie. So a lot of it was like sort of trying to use metaphor to fight the ideological battles of the Cold War.
Right.
And then a lot of it was just, these movies were, often utilizing special effects that were wowing audiences. King Kong was obviously a huge hit when it came out in the 30s, but the thing about King Kong was you couldn't easily imitate King Kong. There was Willis O'Brien who knew how to do that shit, and then basically no one else.
Yeah.
And not that King Kong was the first giant monster movie, because dinosaurs existed in all sorts of silent films. You go back to the silent adaptation of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World for like dinosaur fights. That's often considered sort of ground zero for that kind of giant monster thing. But basically, the giant monster movies were a 50s trend that were inspired partially because some of those movies were very good and created a desire for audiences to see more of them. And then it died because there were so many of them, and a lot of them were very bad. And that was a point where audiences went, you know what? After I see the beginning of the end, I don't necessarily have a craving to see any more giant bugs. So yeah, that's basically like 1957 is just like where the wave crests, and then the tide starts coming back in.
And I made myself a note at the beginning of this where I think that I wrote the three key figures of the giant monster movie are Marion C. Cooper, who did the original King Kong. He had the foresight. And then you have Ray Harryhausen, who took over the ideas that Willis O'Brien was doing. And then in the 50s in particular, you have Ishiro Honda, who does Godzilla, which is kind of the movie that proves that these can be serious movies, I think.
Right. And
1954.
Yes. Godzilla is, probably the best giant monster movie ever made. That would be my argument, is that the original Japanese Godzilla has never been topped.
Yeah.
In terms of just like pure allegorical awe that movie inspires, and just a real commitment to the theme and a real commitment to like tackling really brutal material.
Yeah.
And finding like new and offbeat ways to do it. And I think, I think it's easy to look at the giant monster movies, the American giant monster movies of the 50s, and say, yes, these are the anxieties Americans had. I think it's easy to look at Godzilla and look at the anxieties that post-war Japan had and say, yes, these are the anxieties that Japan had. And then once you get into like the heyday of Japanese giant monsters in the 60s, that's when I think that anxiety sort of slowly gets chopped away, and it just sort of becomes its own thing. And people see giant monsters because they like giant monsters. They don't see giant monsters because it's reflective of their daily lives.
Right. And another couple notes I had here is I think it's worth noting for listeners that are young enough that they didn't have to live through this garbage, that the Cold War and the atomic age are from like the 40s to the early 90s. But there was really there were definitely peaks in the 50s and the 80s. And Jim and I covered it sounded like I said Gemini. Jim and I covered the nuclear fear movies of the 80s. Like Threads and The Day After. And it was interesting to go back in time after kind of immersing myself in those really horrifying, really sad, actual horrors of nuclear attack type movies, and watch these earlier movies when I don't think that the general public really understood the threat of nuclear war outside of Japan, obviously. And I think that they were trying on purpose to abstract the threat so as to not freak people out too much. Whereas by the time we get to the 80s, I think these movies start to be very serious about the threat because, good or bad, those movies had like a purpose, like an anti-war purpose behind them.
For sure. I also think it's worth noting that Hollywood has always been a gleeful participant in the military-industrial complex. And I think, like, whether or not you want to go, like, full conspiracy, like producers getting slipped envelopes full of cash by CIA operatives to make movies where the American military is shown in a good light, or you just want to say like, well, they're giving the public what they wanted because the public also likes seeing modern weapons being fired. Mm-hmm. like Transformers in 2007 was a big hit in part because people like seeing modern military hardware being used realistically,
right?
Even in a completely unrealistic context.
They'd rather see robots being blasted apart than humans, but yeah, for sure.
But like the thing about a Cold War is you can't really have war movies that have just like attack helicopters and tanks and flamethrowers and stuff like that. So I think a lot of these movies become excuses to show off new technologies and specifically new weaponry and the new things that all of the weapons manufacturers have come up with.
Right.
Giant bombs and fighter jets and things of this nature.
My only other thing I have to say is that I just wanted to note that I took 2 film classes in my life. One was in college. It was about media literacy. And then during elementary school, summer school, we took a how to make movies class with camcorders, and we broke off into groups. And I noticed that my friend had this really nice rubber spider toy, and the weird kid that we were paired off with had a ninja costume, so I had a vision, and that was giant spider attacks a city and is killed by a ninja with a magical sword. So when I say I know a thing or two about making giant monster movies, it's because I got down in the trenches and actually made one.
That's right. We have a veteran.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need 3 elements. You need a ninja costume, a good-looking rubber spider, and a mine that can connect the 2.
Yes. Genius. We had a list of 19 movies. 2 of them that we might talk about in part 2 briefly turned out to not actually have giant monsters in them. We were lied to. And one of them is a lost film. So what we really have here are 16 movies to talk about. And we're going to try to cover at least 8 today. Actually, I take that back. One of them, I'm going to say right now, is Quatermass 2, which Jim and I talked about in pretty good detail on the Body Snatcher episode. It's a great movie. I highly recommend it.
Not a giant monster movie, but a movie with giant monsters.
Yeah. It's like a blob movie. It's another thing I've thought about covering is blob movies, because it's kind of interesting how many blob movies there are, but like I've already wasted one of the good ones on now 2 podcasts we've mentioned it. So it's actually going to be only 15 titles that we're covering. So we're going to see how many we covered in this first one. And I'm going to go in the release order according to Letterboxd, which I know is not always the same as the release order according to IMDb or books that Patrick and I might have, or Wikipedia for that matter. This is just an easy way to make a list, put it in order. So this is like probably has something to do with festivals or stuff like that. I don't know where they get their numbers from. So we're going in the order. I'll try to remember to include a link to the list. But our first one is 20 Million Miles to Earth, is directed by Nathan H. Warren or Jarin. I assume it's a Hua J sound, but I don't know for sure. Mm-hmm. I'm going to read the Letterboxd synopses with each one of these, which is another thing I've been doing more recently, just to make it easier to get through this part quickly. So, when the first manned flight to Venus returns to Earth, the rocket crash lands in the Mediterranean near a small Italian fishing village. The locals manage to save one of the astronauts, Colonel Calder, the mission commander. A young boy also recovers what turns out to be a specimen of an alien creature. Growing at a fantastic rate, it manages to escape and eventually threatens the city of Rome. So we're starting strong with not like objectively one of the best movies on this list. It's not a personal favorite of mine, but it is just a good movie. I think that we would these days refer to this as a B movie, but this really actually seems like probably an A-level movie, at least a very high B-level movie.
The thing about, what we consider an A-level movie these days is often determined by, did they spend a ton of money on CGI?
Yeah.
And this is the 1957 equivalent of they spent a ton of money on CGI.
Yeah.
But it's not a 1957 A movie because there are no movie stars, and the script is kind of whatever. Regardless, this is my favorite movie that we are going to be covering. This is number one with a bullet for me. I don't know if it's the greatest of them all, but it's the one I definitely have the most fondness for. And it is those special effects that is the reason.
This is right off the bat. We're not talking about men in suits or puppets. We're going straight into Ray Harryhausen handcrafted effects. And a lot of those movies we kind of, in retrospect, credit to him. But as I said, this was directed by Nathan Warren. who also made the Deadly Mantis, which we'll cover shortly, and the Brain from Planet Arros. He was also responsible for the seventh voyage of Sinbad, which Harryhausen was very famously involved in. And he directed a semi-spoofy movie that called The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. And then he also directed the Harryhausen adjacent stop-motion spectacular Jack the Giant Killer in 1962. Not technically a Harryhausen movie, but like part of his sort of that short period of time where we instead of CG effects, we had Harryhausen effects and people trying to make it look like Harryhausen effects.
This is a film that was released by Columbia Pictures, who Harryhausen was working with exclusively at this point in his career. Previous to this, he made It Came From Beneath the Sea, and he made Earth versus the Flying Saucers. It Came From Beneath the Sea. You don't get a really good look at the monster. You mostly get a good look at its tentacles reaching out of the water. And then Earth versus the Flying Saucers is mostly the stop motion are flying saucers, so they're not articulated little monsters the way you associate with Ray Harryhausen. Some still very good effects. The UFO crashing into the Washington Monuments, one of my all-time favorite moments in a movie from the 50s. Mm-hmm. I can't recall Beast from 20,000 Fathoms if that was also that might have been Warner Brothers. I think Warner Brothers owns it now, so it gets a little. I can't recall at the moment.
Yeah.
But Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, in a lot of ways, is like the movie that starts off the 50s trend of these movies, because it's the movie that inspired Godzilla, and a lot of plot elements from that movie sort of get repeated in a lot of the movies we're going to be talking about. But this era of Harryhausen, which this is the era I'm most familiar with. I haven't watched a lot of his. I've seen Jason and the Argonauts, but I haven't seen any of the Sinbad movies. I haven't seen Clash of the Titans. I haven't seen the Gulliver's Travels movie he made, or the Mysterious Island movie he made. This is the sort of the pinnacle of like his ambition of this era of what he's trying to do, because the thing about stop motion is the actors are not interacting with anything. There is the effects, which are happening in some studio somewhere, and then there are the actors who all of their stuff has already been shot. And trying to get live action and stop motion to sort of play together is very difficult because they're not actually interacting. But this is a movie where Harryhausen specifically creates. It's not a giant monster movie to start. It's a tiny monster movie to start.
That's a key thing to the look. I agree with you there. Yeah.
So what we have is like a little guy, just like a little 5-inch monster running around in a cage at the beginning of this, and then he keeps eating sulfur and growing. And as he scales up, we see him interacting with the world around him in different ways. And so at a certain point, it's like, well, yeah, they matted off this cage, and so it's actors looking at a blank space, and then they put in the cage with the alien in there. And then at a certain point, okay, yeah, you cut from inside the cage when it's it's more of like an animal cage and it's bigger. But then at a certain point, he's running around the countryside. He's spooking other animals. He goes into a barn and attacks a horse. He fights a human being. And so as it scales, he's basically Harryhausen is basically challenging himself to do all of the things that are difficult to do with stop motion. And I think he just the way the live action footage matches the stop motion in terms of lighting, in itself is just it's crazy miracle to me. It's so good looking.
Before I get too much more into what I did, I actually I have a book called Atomic Age Cinema by Barry Atkinson, and there's a whole chapter in that where he watched as many colorized versions of 50s monster movie or B movies as he could, and he rated them, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers was his worst, and this was by far his best, I think in part because it was done digitally way after the fact, much more recently. So I actually watched I had seen this million jillion years ago as a child. So I watched the colorized version of it, and it really does feel like it brings something even more to it, I think. The black and white already looks great, but the sort of Technicolor unreality of the color choices, just how utterly green the little monster is and stuff, actually makes it even more exciting that the things lined up. And I think it actually helps with I don't think they cleaned up the effects or anything like that. I think it just, when you have colors to compare with, it actually made it look even more impressive on this watch. So I usually wouldn't say it's a good idea to watch colorized films, but it was an interesting little experiment for me, at least.
I have a Blu-ray set of Harryhausen movies that has colorized versions of a lot of these things, and it's just one of those things where I would watch them out of curiosity, but whenever I'm in the mood to watch them, I'm specifically in the mood to watch a black and white movie because there's a specific thing I'm going for. I have part of my fondness for this is the part that these 1950s American sci-fi movies have, the way they play a part of a larger culture of this sort of like monster kid, famous monsters of film land, like the way I associate it with comic book shops and movies playing on TV and monster model kits and things like that. Like, to me, it's a nostalgia for a time I wasn't alive in, so it's like a fake nostalgia or something. But like for me, I want it to be black and white because I want it to remind me of all of those things. But it doesn't. But I do know Harryhausen supervised the colorization.
Yeah, he was still alive at the time, so yeah, that probably helps.
It is unfortunately all of these Columbia Harryhausen movies suffer when it comes to like the human beings.
Yeah.
I don't think any of the characters in Beast from 20,000 Fathoms or Came from Beneath the Sea or Earth versus the Flying Saucers are any good. And this is the same thing where it's like we have the perfunctory sort of romantic subplot between a doctor and this astronaut who's recovered from this crash. I will say the interior of the spaceship that crashes into the sea off the coast of Italy looks spectacular.
Yeah, it's got that kind of deco thing that's going to come out when we talk about Kronos that I just really like. There's this retro futurist thing that actually was probably going out of style by 1957, but I still quite like it.
This is, so like I said, this was released by Columbia. Columbia in the 50s was a minor studio. They weren't like Poverty Row or anything, but they were, in this era, there was the big major studios of like MGM and Warner Brothers and Paramount and Fox. And then Universal was below those. And like Columbia is like a little bit below Universal in terms of scale and budget and stuff. But their fortunes were on the rise in the 50s because American government sort of did some antitrust actions to all of these studios that had owned the theaters that their movies played in, and broke up those monopolies. And that way that these smaller studios were able to get more screens in America. So, but all of that is to say that not every Columbia film has this kind of money behind it. The love and care and money that you can tell went into this movie is not present in, say, The Giant Claw or The Werewolf or The Zombies of Moratau or something like that. There are a lot of like horror sci-fi movies from the 50s that this studio produced that were strictly just like cheap cash grabs. Creature with the Atom Brain, I think, is another one that you're just like, oh my God, this is only a hair above a Poverty Row kind of a film. But this one is lavishly produced, and by the time you get to the big climax where the monster is, if not Godzilla-sized, at least King Kong-sized and running around the Colosseum and fighting elephants in the streets of Rome.
Yeah, there's this ongoing thing that I don't know if they did on purpose, but animals fucking hate he's called Ymir by fans because I guess the title was going to be the giant Ymir, as in the god that birthed all frost giants in the Nordic pantheon.
Interesting.
Yeah, and according to the little factoid, Harryhausen thought that people thought that they would be talking about the Emir, like an Arab honorific title, Emir. So whatever. But Emir, the monster, there's a dog that attacks him, and there's an elephant that attacks him, and they're just like, it's like Christine said, well, maybe they just recognize that he's against nature or something. And I think it's mostly because they just want to show a fight, and it's better to do stop motion dogs and elephants than people. But
no, there is one stop motion human getting fucking wrecked by the Ymir.
Yes.
And that is an amazing effect because it cuts to a man holding a pitchfork running, and then it like seamlessly cuts to that man being a stop motion model getting like throttled by the monster, and it's great. I think a lot of the animal stuff is also a byproduct of the original version of this story because Harryhausen had written a story outline called The Cyclops, and it was about an alien Cyclops crash landing into Lake Michigan. And in that version, version of the movie, it goes on a rampage and then gets confined across Chicago, and then it gets confined in a Chicago zoo, and then it escapes and it starts eating cattle from the stockyards of Chicago. So originally it was an American setting, and it was a more domestic, but it was like still very focused on just the Emir fucking up animals. So in terms of the challenge that Harryhausen set out for himself, it's one thing to animate an alien that has a body that no one has ever seen before, so they have nothing to compare it to, but to like say, and then it's going to fight an elephant, and you know what an elephant looks like.
Yeah.
So
and the size too. That helps
so I
too.
can't cheat.
Yeah.
I have to do but it's not that he cheats, but it's not just like a photorealistic elephant. It's got like a little bit of personality to it. It's absolutely phenomenal. But like I think the story behind this movie is basically Harryhausen had an idea, and then he was like, yeah, but what if this idea also netted me an Italian vacation, and me and my wife could go to fucking Italy? And that was where he was like, I rewrote the script. It's better now because it takes place in Italy, and we have all these hilarious Italian stereotypes who get to...
And that's an interesting thing. So I have this, like, as I watch these in the order we're covering them is the order I watched them in for the most part. So hopefully I will be able to interject this stuff a little more organically later on. But I'm going through my notes this time. These weren't necessarily ideas yet. But one of the things is how many of these take place in Mexico. And this is the only one I think that takes place in Europe out of all the ones we covered. There's one takes place in Japan, and all the rest take place in the Americas. Canada, America, United States, or Mexico, basically.
And Quatermass 2 obviously is England, but we're not covering that one.
And we're not covering that one. And one takes place in Antarctica, I suppose. Anyway, that was interesting to me. And there's this fun thing where there are these Italian stereotypes, but a lot of them are Italian actors. So you get the feeling they're playing up their own accents at the behest of the director. Which was amusing to me. The Italian people are like the American lead, or the heroic male lead, which is something I started to make notes on every time, is William Hopper, and he's super dull. And he was what I found interesting is in my mind, he's coming off Rebel Without a Cause, and he has this really uncomfortable scene where his daughter, played by Natalie Wood, is trying to get him to react to her as he would when she was still a child, and tries to keep kissing him, and he gets upset and slaps her, and it's this really shocking moment in the movie, and my mind was on that the whole time, not on the idea of him as a romantic lead or astronaut. And then he gets negative chemistry with his leading lady in this one, Joan Taylor.
Yeah, I don't have actor names.
Joan Taylor.
Joan Taylor.
They have, So there's just no reason for us to buy that, and that's just that's going to become an issue. And I'm going to get. I started to notice more of the quote, like the feminist angle of these things. I hadn't really caught on to it yet, though, because this is the first one I'm watching, and this one doesn't really care that much about their human relationships. So I came across enjoying all of the Italian side characters. The Frank Paliga. Is a especially good elderly Italian scientist who's brought the monster in its larval form. And I think that his introductory scene inspired Sam Neill's introductory scene in Jurassic Park. Where he's kind of introduced talking about things to a kid, but he's the opposite. The Sam Neill character doesn't like children, so he's trying to scare this kid, where this old man wants to get this kid interested in the science.
I will say the same way that Jurassic Park took CGI and was like, what are the things that like are really hard to do with CGI, and how do we get that to work? How do we get people to buy it? You know, how do we not just have like a stained glass sort of knight in young Sherlock Holmes? Yeah. How do we get like a living, breathing animal? You know, that sort of thing. Like it is a same project as Harryhausen challenging himself with this, and obviously Spielberg is a huge Harryhausen fan.
Yeah,
so that wouldn't surprise me if it did inspire him. Going back to the romance, something that we will see throughout these movies is the anxiety of the Soviets, the anxiety of atomic warfare, the anxiety of Sputnik and the Cold War and all of that is one anxiety that is explored in these movies. The other is, what do you do with women in post-war America when you tell them to stop working in the factories and they have to go back to being housewives, but now they have a different status than they did pre-war, because they are now sort of been partially assimilated into America as professionals.
Yeah.
Almost all of the female leads of these movies, and there are very few of these movies that don't have a female lead of some sort.
I started to make a note of the token female, because a lot of them have exactly one female lead.
Right, and sometimes I think maybe at least one of these or whatever, it's just someone's wife or whatever. Mm-hmm. But mostly it's a professional, and they almost all have a moment where someone's like, look, lady, da-da-da. And she's like, actually, I'm a scientist, or actually, I'm a journalist. I'm a doctor. It's like, just because I'm fucking gorgeous, just because I'm Mara Corday, Playboy Playmate 1959, like, don't get it twisted. I'm also a scientist.
Yeah.
And like, I think part of what these movies are exploring with those is it's just sort of like, well, does this movie have a woman in it? We need some romance. It's sort of a perfunctory checklist sort of a thing that you expect from Hollywood studio filmmaking. Mm-hmm. But then the other part of it is like a navigation of modern anxiety, and the role that gender plays in American society in the 50s is part, especially the late 50s, and you get to 1957, is part of that.
Yeah, the only flat out I mean, these are pretty, I'm going to be making fun of them throughout for their treatment of women, but they are pretty progressive based on when they were released. I just want to also note there's a bumpkin fisherman who refers to a trailer. He can't think of the word behind it. What do you call a trailer when you tow it? So he refers to it as, he drives a car with a house that follows like a goat. It's such a strange, but it's like he doesn't know the English word for trailer, like a goat. I love that bit. And then that brings me to the other thing that makes me love this movie so much. Part of it, obviously, is special effects. The other thing is, I think a lot of these movies, something that unites them are the driest, blandest, most like Boy Scout, square-jawed fucking male leads you can imagine. Yeah.
All of these movies are about like how military procedure and the rugged masculinity of the American military, defeats all comers.
Yeah.
And as a result, you're not allowed to have a lot of like anti-heroes or flawed heroes, or you don't have that film noir Robert Mitchum kind of energy to them. They're all just like very bland.
Yeah.
But this movie, in its sort of context and presentation, even if the male lead of this movie is not very interesting, in presenting this like comedic, slightly campy Italian setting, I think it is just sort of saying like, no, these movies are fun. Just have fun. Don't worry about it. This is like, don't take this. You don't have to take this seriously. We're not going to just like start hurling scientific mumbo jumbo at you. And when we do, you already know it's the kind of movie where a little boy has to explain to a grown man what Texas is. So you already know, like, okay, I don't have to take this seriously.
Well, yeah,
the alien doesn't have skin, or it has no heart or lungs. It just has a network of small tubes through its body. And you're like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's I warned you that I have some fucking dork moments in this, where like things that just don't matter. But I was actually really amused by this one, is that how much they actually get, according to what they knew about the science of Venus, how much of it they actually get right and take into account. For instance, the fact that the creature would eat sulfur makes sense for what they knew about Venus at the time, that it would be a mostly gassy, really hot planet. But it's funny that they still make him a big lizard man instead of like a jellyfish or something. Like they're still like, well, we still want him to be like a fun monster. We don't want him to be abstract or anything like that. Like, this is this doesn't matter. This is me being a fucking dork, but just the idea that they probably don't have lizard men walking around on Venus. What do they think who they think they're fooling? But one of the things I do give this one credit for is that at the very least, the U.S. government is, in a way, there's just a smidgen of controversy here, in that this is America's fault. They did not warn this country that there was going to be a crash. That they've crash landed an experimental vessel in foreign waters, and it is all their fault that this giant monster breaks out and destroys a bunch of stuff.
And for some time they're trying to cover up.
Yes,
this.
and they are. Yes, and that's important too. And so I think that is not a common thing here. Usually they don't get very critical of any of that stuff. So the fact that there's just an ounce of criticalness is actually something in this film's favor. I think it just makes it a little smarter, and a little more aware of its context, I think.
I mean, I watch these movies without MST3K. I watch these movies without, trying to find all the ways I can make fun of them or whatever. But if you do just like want to goof off on these movies, Harryhausen, self-conscious that he is sort of creating his own King Kong, tries to mirror. He didn't write the script, but I mean, he originated the project in a way that I'm sure he had a lot of say into the writing of the film. He tries to mirror the ending of King Kong by trying to do his counterpoint to "It Was Beauty That Killed the Beast."
Yeah.
Where after the alien has been killed and falls from the Colosseum and a crowd has gathered around its dead body, someone turns to someone else and goes, "Why must scientific advancement be so costly?"
Yes. Yeah, I mean...
And it's very unclear what he means by that. It's like, I don't think this is a movie about scientific advancement necessarily. Like, I guess you built a good spaceship, but that was just an alien.
Yeah, that was just a monster. That was not advancement. That was a mistake. Yeah. Well, actually, that's one of my problems with the movie is that it's a little... The third act in particular is just sort of King Kong. Which is pretty much the same problem I have with The Valley of Gwangi, which is another Harryhausen one he worked on, didn't direct, is that also sort of just turns into King Kong. And I think, I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but I'm thinking I may have this note for one other movie in here too. It's interesting that this one ends in a Roman Colosseum and Gwangi ends in a church cathedral. I feel like that there's no mistake there. Whereas King Kong ends on the Empire State Building, but I feel like Harryhausen had some sort of like this has to be meaningful. We have to kill it in a meaningful place.
Sometimes you get that. I think the deadly mantis, is seen climbing the Washington Monument at a certain
sometimes
point.
It's just about I think that King Kong's biggest influence was it told disaster movies you got to show something people recognize from the skyline.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not just like New York City. It was specifically like you got to show them Depression era New York City. You have to show them literally the city that lives outside the theater so that then they believe the fantastic thing is coexisting with them.
Yeah. And then going back to what you're saying about the quirky characters and the kid explaining Texas, there's this interesting thing that starts to happen, and I'm glad I made a note of this. This little kid is the one who finds the monster. He's just a greedy kid, and he only does the right thing when money is involved. He only tells people what he found and shows where he took it after they agree to pay him. But it's funny because he's still a child, so he only wants money to buy cowboy gear because he's obsessed with American cowboys. So he wants a cowboy hat, and then he wants a whole horse. And this is a weird repeating motif through at least 3 other movies that we're going to talk about here. But when you're talking about an inadvertently funny thing, the only one really like goofy moment that I don't think I was supposed to laugh at that I did laugh at is that they're trying to keep the monster asleep so that it stops growing. And most of the time when that goes tragic, it's an issue of human hubris. But in this case, it's just bad rigging. And it clumsily, while they're trying to show a press conference, instead of like freaking out King Kong with too much flash photography, they just accidentally lose something with their rigging and it falls down and it breaks everything. And there's something very funny about how they probably would have gotten away with it if they had only like paid attention to one wire, and then it just went wrong. I found that very funny.
That's sort of the Jurassic Park thing as well.
Yeah, but even in Jurassic Park, it's someone doing something stupid, like bad on purpose. The guy's messing things up on purpose so that he can escape. This is just someone didn't check the tensile strength of something.
But in both cases, the temptation to like point to it and say like, the hubris of science. Yeah. They thought they could control nature, but you can't control nature. And it's like, well, no, it's about someone sabotaged their park.
Yeah.
In Jurassic Park, it's not about the hubris of science. No. It's about one guy sabotaging everything.
It's about the hubris of thinking that every human involved with your capitalist venture would be interested in the well-being of every other human involved in your capitalist venture.
It's a very different and in this case, it's just sort of like,
it's just a mistake.
No, it's just a mistake.
The only other note I have is that there is this inadvertent undercurrent, this undercurrent of inadvertent germ warfare that they kind of dump that is actually kind of scary, where there's some sort of space sickness, and once the last guy who has it dies, they don't bring it up again. But it's sort of like there's like implied that there'll be a secondary awful thing happening that doesn't really happen. That I found kind of interesting, that was maybe part of Harryhausen's original script. But that's just the idea that we don't get a lot of space sickness, and we don't get a lot of giant monsters that also create a plague of some kind. And the only one I could think of, because it's my favorite, is Hedora, the smog monster. But
sure.
There's got to be another example of it.
Oh, that's. I mean, I haven't seen it, but we had a genre grinder special where we discussed it. Is that not a plot element of Cloverfield?
Yeah, well, it's lice in particular. It's lice bite people and give them a horrible disease that blows them up.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it took until that long for that to come up again. I found that interesting. Maybe it's another of these things where these 1957 movies, I feel like most of these filmmakers are trying not to freak out the audience too much. They're trying to let them go on a ride. They don't want to make them contemplate their mortality. You know. That's why we don't see too much radiation burns or anything like that.
I think 20 Million Miles to Earth is like, it is 1957 and American children want to see cool monsters. Mm-hmm. I think Toshiro Honda's Godzilla is like, we want to traumatize you, the audience.
Yes.
Specifically you, the people of Japan, who will be horrified and reminded of horrible things in our recent history.
Yes.
But yeah, generally speaking, the target audience for these movies was children.
Yes.
Which is like, it does not disqualify them from being good movies or well-made or interesting or worth being talked about.
I love children's movies. I would never, yeah.
That's a debate that happens every 6 months on the internet is Star Wars for children? You know what I mean? And it's like one of those things where the people who get angriest at the implication are the people who think that for children means, beneath consideration.
Yeah.
Which is not true. And that we would not be doing fucking 9 hours on the giant monster movies of 1957 if we thought that they were all just like dumb garbage for babies.
Yeah. Which is actually a pretty good segue into...
Oh, speaking of dumb garbage...
Dumb garbage for babies. Our second film, unless you had something else you needed to bring up on...
I mean, I'm just gonna say the next film we're gonna be talking about, to me, feels more like dumb garbage for pot smokers. Yeah. There's something about Roger Corman's work that feels more oriented towards teenagers than little kids. Even when he got as silly as Attack of the Crab Monsters. So I'm
going to read, this is Roger Corman. A group of scientists travel to a remote island to study the effects of nuclear weapons tests, only to get stranded when their airplane mysteriously explodes. The team soon discovers that the tests have given rise to crabs mutated into intelligent, impervious, telepathic giants intent on increasing their numbers by breeding, then traveling to populated areas to feed, and which do not intend to be stopped by their discoverers. So that's the plot of the film, and you have to see it maybe 7 times to remember all that shit, because it is the most slapdash, on purpose slapdash thing, is what I found out briefly researching it. It's just like Corman was, from what I understand, there was an interview with the writer who said Corman came up to him and said, "Hey, I want to do this experiment where we write a film that is just action and scares, and I want to see if it works." And the writer figured out later, oh, no, Corman just wanted to only shoot those parts and not have to delete all the other stuff, because that takes time and money to shoot footage that you're not going to use. And so he wanted as streamlined of a script as he could get. And then apparently at a certain point realized, oops, I overdid it. So at the beginning of the movie, there's this very awkward, clearly unplanned narration that quickly explains who everybody is, because they realize that we have no context at all for who these people are and how to tell them apart.
And this AIP era of Roger Corman, he was really cranking them out. I think 1957 is one of his peak output years. He made like 6 or 7 movies.
Yeah.
And this is the era of working very fast and very cheap and not doing second takes. So it's like sometimes a scene happens and you're not sure what happened because it was just underexposed.
Yep.
And did they go back and do reshoots? Hell no, they didn't go back and do reshoots. You just don't know what they're looking at.
Yep.
Yeah, and the scene introducing all the characters is like that, where it's like, oh, the timing doesn't really work. Like, it wasn't framed correctly, where it's not characters passing by the camera in a way that there's only one person on screen, and therefore the person being talked about is the one that you see. It's like all of the characters on screen the entire time, they're all being described, so you're just like, wait, okay, I lost count. I guess they're on the fifth name? What? Who? I do want to say, there is a certain type of Roger Corman movie, and despite sometimes what his name gets associated with, it is a outlier in his filmography. He was mostly a competent director who made movies that made sense and were not just like, oh, haha, you see the boom mic in every shot and you can see the strings on the whatever. Like, no, generally speaking, he knew what he was capable of and he did it. But every once in a while, there is a Roger Corman movie that is this kind of slapdash and baffling and was clearly just like pieced together and like you get all sorts of tonal whiplash and you get all these like abandoned subplots. At one point they're like, oh, there's oil in this caves, of course, and you're like, wait, why is that important? And you're like, don't worry, we forgot about it already. And there are just so many plot elements in Attack of the Crab Monsters. There are psychic crabs.
Yes.
They are giant psychic crabs with human faces. They are giant psychic crabs with human faces who don't have what we would consider corporeal bodies because objects pass through them because their atoms aren't connected to each other.
Yes.
They can control explosions with their mind. They are actively exploding the island the movie takes place in, making it shrink and smaller and smaller. This is not a movie that has a big demolition budget, so this is mostly implied via special effects and characters just stating, well, that part of the island's gone.
Yeah.
So that element also very confusing. There is a tie to real life. There was a real life atomic incident. Which to me, again, is like, I think Corman's a little hipper than your average, schlock generator. Bert I. Gordon would not think to make a movie about crabs that are specifically caused by H-bomb fallout from the Illuge lab being destroyed by Operation Ivy. So like the idea of tying it into modern politics and the idea of like including gore that is more graphic than you would expect to see in a movie from 1957. I have a note saying
it's gruesome. It's not necessarily you're seeing gore, but you got beheadings and stuff. It's pretty gruesome.
Almost immediately, in a way that like for a movie that never stops disorienting you, the first thing that is extremely disorienting is a character falls off a boat in what has to be 3 feet of water. And then you cut to what looks like a bottomless ocean and a giant crab underneath it reaching out for this guy who fell. And then they pull him back up and his head has been cut off. And the physics of this whole event are just like, one, you're shocked by the violence, but also you're shocked by like, wait, what did I see? Why? And then it's so long before the characters even know that there are giant crabs. So like there's this weird dramatic irony happening. All of this stuff makes it feel like not just inept, but druggy.
Yeah.
And it's 1957. This is not an era of where psychedelic culture has any hold on the mainstream. Obviously, people have been smoking pot forever. Obviously, in the 50s, there were hallucinogens and stuff like that, but that wasn't part of the culture.
Yeah.
But like, the opening credits play over this like really awesome abstract art.
Yeah, it looks
by
like
Paul Julian.
Oh, is that okay? Yeah, because I didn't figure out who. Yeah, it looks like those like when I was a kid, I'd look at 40s and 50s pulp novels and just look at the covers, and it just looks like a great one of those.
So Paul Julian did a lot of Roger Corman opening credits of this era. So Roger Corman, there's something like for a guy who makes a movie called Attack of the Crab Monsters, there's something erudite about the paintings and the font of the opening credits. It's not like a big sensational title blasting towards the screen with an explosion behind it. It's like got this weird vibey thing. It's like it's called Attack of the Crab Monsters, but it is made by the guy who would do a series of Freudian Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. You know, it's from the director of The Trip. And so it's hard to talk about this movie because I just don't know what the fuck happens in it. But it is another one of my favorites on this list, if only because it has all of the elements that make me such a Roger Corman fan. It has this just personality and slight edge to it and willingness to just swing hard and try something. As long as that something doesn't cost a lot of money, he was always willing to try it. That I really respect about the and again, like the monsters themselves, the giant crabs with human faces, are so fucking funny looking.
Yeah, I was looking through books that would complain about how this was a movie. I don't understand where they're coming from, but it was a decent movie with bad monster designs. When I think that the monster designs are so incredibly uncanny that they're actually maybe one of the best things about the movie. That these weird human faces on these crabs, like the thing I had in my little brain was I kept on thinking about comic books of the 60s, and I kept on coming up with connections to that sort of Silver Age comic book stuff, and that people were pulling from this, and I just felt like we know that they're mutated crabs, but there's just this sort of like maybe they're actually hyper evolved humans. Because there's this sort of joke in the biology community about how animals keep evolving into crabs. And so the fact that they're also telepathic just made me think of the X-Men. But so you brought up the one thing I wanted to bring up already, where they don't have corporeal bodies, but there's no real good way to represent that on screen. So you have to keep being told that, which is really weird. But the other thing is that when you die, you don't just become. It's not like a zombie where you die and you become a zombie. When you die, you don't even become a ghost. You become a part of the telepathic crab like mind field. You know, like they all are like of one big mind, and they all exist in this conscious like bubble. But they're also big dumb crab monsters. Hold on, what, Christine? Like a man-o-war. Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, it's like a bunch of... I don't think they thought of that, but yeah, there are a lot of sea animals that are actually several animals that make up one animal. But it's so bizarre that they're like, we're not ghosts and we're not crabs yet. We're part of the Crab Collective, and you will join us in the Crab Collective. Now that I'm thinking about maybe that's supposed to be a communism thing. I don't know. I don't think it was. I don't think any of it was thought through that way. There's just there's so many things that like they talk about an indestructible worm monster at some point that you never get to see. And the really gorgeous credits you were talking about, it features giant octopuses, not crabs. So and there's like a story where Corman was like, I need some sort of monsters, and he asked his assistant if crabs or lobsters are scarier. And she just picked crabs because she likes to eat lobster, and she didn't want to have to see things she liked to eat killing people. But it just seems like so much of it, there was these ideas, and then they were just being abandoned left and right. But it is the note I have here is that it is actually a body snatcher movie. It's something that Jim and I missed because I've never heard it referred to as a body snatcher movie. But in a lot of ways, they are stealing their victims' consciousness and making it into part of the Crab Monster Collective, and it's very similar to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where they're all like one organism. Basically, they're all of one thought. It's stuff like that maybe make it impossible. The weird crab faces and those big ideas that maybe they don't go into, but they're still there, make it a pretty interesting movie.
The other thing, it's not a dynamic that's super highlighted just because there are no subplots in this movie that are completely clear. But something that Corman would go to again and again, and it is worth saying for someone who was cranking out B movies left and right, this and possibly if you want to like squint, Little Shop of Horrors, those are the only giant monster movies in his oeuvre, because generally speaking, giant. I mean, we're talking about 16 movies, 17 movies that were made in 1957 that are, giant monster movies, something like that. Like that's a lot, but that's not as much as, for example, the number of slasher movies that came out in 1981.
Right.
And the thing about a slasher movie is, which any kid who's made a Halloween fan film can tell you, is all you need is a mask and a knife and some fake blood, and you can like sort of hack out a slasher movie.
Yeah.
But giant monster movies require a certain level of Oh, you know what? Monster on the Ocean Floor, I think one of the first Roger Corman directed movies. I think it was his first sci-fi movie. He started off doing a couple westerns, but I think his first sci-fi movie was Monster on the Ocean Floor. I think technically that is giant. But
okay. I know
generally... Go ahead.
There's one sort of, I don't remember which movie it was. There's one where it's giant from the standpoint that it's slightly taller than a person, and I can't remember what that monster's called. But it's they have to like wrap it around themselves. It was very. But I think we had, since we didn't count half human, I think that a giant monster has to be at least, we'll say 20 feet tall before it.
Well, unfortunately, that would discount the monster that challenged the world. So I think we have to go with the 12 feet, or maybe it's proportional to it's either 20 feet tall or proportional to what you expect a monster of that size to be, or an animal of that size to be.
That works too.
But what I was going to say is something that pops up in a lot of Roger Corman movies that aren't giant monster movies is like love triangles and the concept of like two men fighting to the death over a woman, and like the end of the world sparking, like, if we're going to repopulate, you're going to be my bride. No, she's going to be my bride. Like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's like a weird, like, cucky thing going on with Roger Corman.
Yeah.
That is just like, for a man who's just so sweet and soft-spoken and intelligent, he just always comes across like this avuncular professor type. There's a lot of weird, kinky shit in the movies that he directed and produced. And there's a little bit of that in this, where the final three humans that exist are two men who are both in love with the same woman, and a giant crab. And the one man sacrifices himself to kill the crab, leaving the other man to claim the woman as the prize, obviously. Yeah. Which is, it's just like a weird element to, because normally it is just like, there's a male lead. He sees a beautiful woman. They both turn to the camera and go, you know what this is, right? And the audience goes, yeah, it's a romantic subplot that we don't care about. And then the actors go, that's right. And then they go back to the movie. And like, the idea of there being some sort of challenge to the romance is not something that I think appears in many of these movies, if any.
I actually want to go back to where you're saying something about the gore. I just remembered there's a scene where someone loses a hand because a rock falls on it. And just the idea of losing a hand because a rock fell on it and just shattered it to the point where it fell off is such a strange visual. And then the my thing here, my big brain idea here is that this is the second movie in a row where electricity is the monster's weakness. And I took the idea that this has something to do with people being comfortable with established technology, like the electricity, and fearful of new technology like nuclear energy. So you have to use the electricity to stop the nuclear energy. That was my attempt at over-intellectualizing a very stupid movie.
I mean, that makes sense to me. This is on 96 Greer's, my other podcast. We recently covered the Brad Bird movie Tomorrowland, and in doing that, I did some research on the history of Disneyland and the Tomorrowland section of Disneyland and all that. And this is the era of the. These movies reflect the anxieties of the future, but this is the era of the like sunny optimist futurist thing where it's like the home of the future. You, housewife, won't have to lift a finger because all your gadgets and appliances that you will buy from GE will solve all your problems. It's like conspicuous consumption will solve all of life's woes.
Yeah.
The electric house of the future has an oven like a Murphy bed. Like. So, like, yeah, I do think electricity was producing all sorts of novel appliances, and then also, like, visions of the novel appliances of the future. At a certain point, Americans stopped buying electric carving knives. They realized they could just buy a carving knife.
Yeah, and use their arm.
And that works just fine. But there was a bit there where we thought everything had to be plugged in. I don't know anyone my age who owns an electric blanket, but that was not an uncommon item to be seen in a household at one point.
Yeah, I had. This is not going to make the final cut, but I had a friend who wanted an electric blanket in Tucson, and his parents got it for him, and then they read the instructions, and it said that it really has to be below 65 degrees for you to be able to tell it's on, and they had to break it to him that they never let their house get below 75 degrees. My last note on this one is another case of me trying to find inspiration from movies I like and know. There's one of the better scenes in the movie is of the Pamela Duncan character or her stunt double scuba diving in what is clearly an aquarium tank. It's a really long scene, so I think that they rented time in an aquarium tank and they wanted to get every cent worth out of it. But I do wonder, because she is so provocatively dressed and the camera is ogling her, my first thought was, oh, this is just in reaction to Creature from the Black Lagoon. But then a part of me said, is this what they had in mind in the scene in Fulci Zombie, where the woman scuba dives topless and then gets attacked by a shark and then later a zombie? That was my one connection. Is did Fulci or one of the writers have that in mind? Like, oh, we can outdo that. A woman in a bathing suit is one thing, but a topless woman, that's where the money's really at. That's how we're gonna.
I have to say, I believe it's a little simpler. I think people like sexy ladies and enjoy when they get to see one in a movie.
Yeah, but it's just like the scuba diving.
A lot of this era's Roger Corman movies would have like the Teenage Caveman. I think also came out in 1957, and I think that has a scene where like a topless girl is swimming in the lagoon, and you see her naked back, and it's like very I'm in a drive-in, and this is pretty sexy stuff. Like,
yeah,
I think that was just sort of. Yeah, I mean, obviously Julie Adams in her white bathing suit in Creature from the Black Lagoon, utterly iconic.
Yeah.
But I think also, in addition to that, people just like seeing sexy ladies.
Yeah. Well, this is also the first example of many very unnecessary women in swimsuit scenes. Like they really went out of their way in some of these movies to find, like, we have to get a woman in a swimsuit at some point. And actually, the next movie we're going to talk about has one of the more unnecessary ones that I could think of, but to the point where I only noticed it because I was starting to look for these things. But that's all I got for Attack of the Crab People, which is
I don't have anything else.
Almost
to add to that.
A real motion picture.
Public domain, worth seeking out on YouTube or wherever else you can see these kinds of movies.
It's so funny because it's sandwiched between probably the two biggest budgeted, most studio-like movies that we covered. This whole thing is arguably the most chaotically unconcerned with filmmaking one is sandwiched between. So the next one we have is The Incredible Shrinking Man, directed by Jack Arnold, a real director. Well, okay, Corman's a real director. A director who cares about what he's doing at this exact moment in time.
There we go.
And this one was your idea to pick because it's technically not a giant monster movie. It's the opposite, but it's kind of it ends up actually inspiring some of the later films that came out at the end of the year. So and I think it was important to cover. So this one is also one of the few that maybe people have actually seen that are listening to this that are just.
It's in the Criterion Collection.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I. So
unlike the giant claw.
Yeah, which is part of the Arrow collection, but
that's so which label that we side with here on Genre Grinder.
Okay, so a dangerous combination of radiation and insecticide causes the unfortunate Scott Carey to shrink slowly but surely until he is only a few inches tall. His home becomes a wilderness where he must survive everything from spiders living in the cellar to his beloved cat. Okay, we got 2 stars here. It's written by Richard Matheson, directed by Jack Arnold. Arnold was a genuinely talented guy, probably the only Oscar-nominated filmmaker we're going to discuss here. He was nominated for a 1950 documentary called With These Hands. But most people know him as the guy behind The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which we just talked about. And 2 years before this, he had directed Tarantula, which is another one of those movies like Them, which is remembered by some people as being silly, but is actually pretty good for what it is, kind of thing. Like, I think Them is remembered for being genuinely good, but Tarantula is one of the better ones.
I think the movies that predate 1957 that serve as sort of strong inspirations for a lot of these movies was obviously King Kong, but then also you have Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, you have Them, and then Tarantula is directly ripped off by I think the best scene in The Deadly Mantis.
Yeah.
So like I think Tarantula also sort of exists as once they did all of these things well, that's when everyone started rushing in to say, well, how much money can we make if we don't do it so well?
Yeah.
And so Jack Arnold is one of the people who had already done it well. And you're probably not listening to Genre Grinder if you're not a fan of John Carpenter. It should be said that Jack Arnold directed It Came from Outer Space. And It Came from Outer Space has one shot in it that John Carpenter spent the entire rest of his career recreating, where there are like the creepy silhouettes of the aliens in the background as the characters sort of look from the foreground. And that's Assault on Precinct 13. That goes all the way to Prince of Darkness. That's just like, that's The Shape, obviously. Like John Carpenter owes a lot to Jack Arnold. And that is not a connection that is always brought up. But, like, it should be said that, like, It Came from Outer Space from 1953 is also, like, a very foundational sort of horror sci-fi classic.
Arnold also directed, a couple years after this, very underrated these days political satire called The Mouse That Roared. And he directed a better than its title would lead you to believe Fred Williamson blaxploitation western, which I'm going to refer to as Boss N-Word.
Yeah.
That was one of his last movies. That's actually a pretty good movie, and if you liked Django Unchained, you watch that movie and the Legend of N-Word Charlie, which is sort of a pseudo prequel. Tarantino really took a lot from those two films. Jack Arnold is a great filmmaker. And then Richard Matheson is like one of the greatest horror sci-fi pulp writers of all time. And he was one of the few who transitioned well into being a screenwriter. I would say him and Bradbury were like the two big names of that era that went, oh yeah, I can write movies too. Like you don't hear about Asimov didn't write a lot of movies, that kind of, there was just something about his, the way he worked that worked. So his greatest hits that I'm just going to run through quickly are I Am Legend, which was adapted to film 3 times and a huge inspiration on Night of the Living Dead. He wrote Hell House. He wrote the scripts for most of Corman's Poe movies. And then, of course, the perennial classic, Jaws 3. Where the one that takes place inside a SeaWorld, and somehow SeaWorld decided this was a good way to spend their brand, was a movie where people go to their park and are eaten by sharks.
Matheson is, I think he gets to be where he is because he is A, immensely talented, and B, not so full of himself because of that talent that he's not willing to work on films that aren't or work that isn't classy, because he's also like a TV writer. He's also like a big part of why the Twilight Zone is thought of the way it is now. And not all of the fantasy, science fiction, horror writers of that era were willing to stoop down to the level of television and film. Not all of them were willing to take a paycheck from Roger Corman to adapt Pit and the Pendulum, for example. Right. But like Matheson was fucking game.
But like Vincent Price, he almost always elevates it too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Also wrote the short story that Duel is based on.
Yes, which is
Duel being one of my favorites. So
just really knew what he was doing. Good guy. I think a lot of people know him for I Am Legend and the fact that Stephen King talks about him a lot as an inspiration.
Mm-hmm. And The Incredible Shrinking Man is a great example of a movie that is overperforms. It delivers much more than you might think. For a lot of these movies where it's just like something starts small and that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or like something is the wrong size. The metaphor is pretty weak, but there's a lot to chew on for The Incredible Shrinking Man.
Yeah, and when also I forgot to mention that this was originally Matheson's book. He adapted his own book, and then this one is based on, like I said in the description, this is errant radiation, But it's interesting that they bring insecticide into it. And I don't believe that this was like general public. I think it was the same thing how smoking, like suddenly people went, oh my God, smoking's dangerous. And then it seems very obvious that it's dangerous. I don't think that the DDT scare was in the 70s. It was quite a way down. And I know that people know that chemicals are bad, but I think that things were still being sold to us post-war that, no, these things will kill the bugs and you'll be fine. And people are like, cool, we'll be fine. You know, they sort of like ran with it. If the advertiser told them they'd be fine, they were like, okay, great. So
thalidomide is completely safe.
Yeah, exactly. and so I think it's a little interesting that they added radiation to it, and that's what I was just alluding to with the unnecessary bathing suit scene, is that he gets irradiated while they're on a boat at the very beginning of the movie, and the only reason his wife isn't irradiated, going back to the feminist themes that I'm going to be bringing up ad nauseum here, is the only reason she's not also irradiated is because he's too lazy to go get his own champagne. I believe it's champagne or food. I can't remember what. And so she goes she goes down into the boat and isn't hit by the errant radiation / insecticide thing that hits him. He wants a beer. Okay, that's even more masculine than champagne,
right.
I guess.
I think, yeah, right from the very beginning, what we have is you have this sort of luxury setting of the economic boom of post-war America, where it's like a happy, young, sexy married couple on their boat that they own, wearing very little, lying down next to each other. The sexual implications are obvious. It's not hard to imagine they're fucking on that boat. And then he tells her to get him a beer, and immediately we have this pushback. We have this pushback. We have this: women in 1957 are not women in 1947. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They have this playful but still loaded conversation about, well, how much of a servant am I to you just because I'm your wife?
Yeah.
And he is sort of operating. So it's a movie that like presents the idealized American couple and then presents the conflict of where the man sees himself and where the woman sees herself, and sort of the battle of wills that is happening in these romantic relationships at the time. And then it is all that sets the stage for, once he starts to shrink, his anxiety. Obviously, radiation is involved, so there's atomic anxiety. There is, I think Matheson specifically said, like, this was inspired by, like, how do you come to terms with the fact that at any moment your life can be taken from you because someone somewhere pushed a button?
Yes.
And therefore the bombs started, the missiles started flying, the ICBMs are in the air, and there's no going back. And it's like that takes something from you, that takes a level of agency from you. And so you have man weakened in his own household as this sort of patriarchal figure. You have man weakened by radiation and modernity. You have sexual implications and therefore sexual frustration of the man getting smaller. It's this like really juicy, loaded stuff. But because it's 1957, there isn't a moment. You can't have a scene where she's like, I don't mind fucking you just because you're a foot shorter. Like, you can't actually like talk about the biological implications of like,
yeah, but they get awfully close to, you have to really not be paying attention to not see where they're going with it.
Exactly. And that was the thing. I think the first time I saw The Incredible Shrinking Man, I just saw it as like, all right, serve me some cool special effects. And turns out that there are a lot of cool, like Jack Arnold said, sure, I'll do that. And there's a lot of cool special effects. And I'm like, yeah, that was a cool sci-fi movie from the 50s.
Yeah.
And then this time watching it, I was like, oh, okay, I see what Matheson is doing here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is possible to not pay attention to what is being said,
I suppose.
But when you do, you realize like, oh, this is a much richer and a lot more personal a text than you get out of so many of these movies.
I'm sure that there's all sorts of stuff about his shrinking being not just his sense of masculinity and his physical masculinity are going away as he shrinks, because and in the scene like you're referring to one scene in particular where he sort of runs away from home and puts himself in bad danger because he can't fuck his wife. He's like in frustration, he just runs away and like really he puts himself in a situation where everybody's staring at him and where he could just get hit by a car or eaten by a dog or something. I mean, he's like maybe 3 feet tall at this point in the movie. He's not disappeared entirely. But the problem with this, which is not a problem for the movie on the way its own wavelength, but the problem for the movie as something you enjoy watching is that he is such a bitter guy that he's really hard to like the whole movie.
Yeah,
and she's trying so hard to be like she's like, none of this matters to me. You're what matters to me, and he just. What happens later in a movie that we're going to talk about in the second part, which I'll just say the Amazing Colossal Man, is that they write into that movie that the reason he's acting like a prick is because the radiation, the growing is making him mad. It's driving him crazy. That doesn't really happen here. He's driving himself crazy by being so upset by it. But for myself, the reason I sort of related to him is that I think that there's additional subtext, that this is sort of a movie about not necessarily cancer, but something like cancer, where you're given a death sentence basically by doctors, and everybody around you is saying, this doesn't matter to me, you're still important to me, but you're like, yeah, but I'm deteriorating, and there's a real sense of dread with that the movie doesn't fuck around with.
For sure. Randy Stewart plays his wife in this movie. She is given such a hard job.
Yes.
Because it is fantastic material, and in once the special effects start actually kicking into high gear, obviously the way they do it is that they just do a sort of a split screen effect where she's not actually acting with this man, because he is acting on a set that is sort of scaled to be much bigger than himself to make him look 3 feet tall. And then she is on a identical set but has been scaled to her like to normal human size, and she's looking down at nothing and sort of talking to thin air, but she still has to emotionally ground a movie. There's one scene in particular where she thinks that her husband has been eaten by a cat. And I'm like, that's a bad day as an actor when the director's like, okay, your husband has just been eaten by your cat. Go. Like, that is a very strange emotion to try to hit.
Yeah.
And Randy Stewart, she does a great job. She's very good. I think the reason he's such a dick in this movie is because this movie is about taking everything away from him to build him back up.
Yeah.
There is this reassertion of masculinity. It's not about him realizing that his masculinity doesn't matter. It's about him reclaiming masculinity in this new context. He can't be the man that he thought he was going to be, but he can be the caveman who fights the mammoth.
Who kills the spider, yeah.
So, because the part of this movie that makes it a giant monster movie is... and this is the framing device for the novel, is it starts off with him being chased by this giant spider, and then it flashes back to how he initially started shrinking, and then it keeps going back and forth to him trying to deal with this one problem, which is he is in a basement. Everyone thinks he is dead, so no one knows he's there, and there is a spider trying to eat him. And it is all about like primitive man. It's like a movie about like a man on a deserted island or something, where he's just like, he's got to learn how to build the tools, he's got to learn how to get water, he's got to learn how to start a fire, he's got to learn where he's going to sleep, where shelter is, and he builds himself back up into this like primitive masculine form, and he slays this fucking spider, and its goo fucking sprays on him as he stabs it. It's awesome.
He's baptized in its blood.
And then from there, he like sort of then he becomes who's the there's a famous American writer who did Walden, fucked off to the woods, and transcendentalist.
Yes, Walt Whitman.
Yeah, then he becomes like a Walt Whitman type as he shrinks even further and sort of becomes one with the cosmos. And he has to build himself down to like primitive man, and then from there he builds himself up to philosopher.
Yeah.
As the ending of this movie has this incredible speech where he's talking about, he goes, "Am I a human being or am I the man of the future?"
Yeah.
And as he shrinks so small that like he is now interacting with particles that none of us can see, and that arc is so fucking fascinating.
Apparently, Arnold wrote that whole final monologue himself.
Really?
Yeah, that's the rumor, the thing that was on like the trivia.
That's interesting. It's really interesting monologue. And again, so many of these movies have cool special effects, and they're a little corny and cheesy in ways that are a lot of fun, and they're like 76 minutes. They're really short movies.
Yeah.
So a lot of these are just like, put it on, have a good fun time, but all of the parts where you don't see a monster, they're often quite dry.
Yeah.
And they don't have much ambition about examining the human condition.
Yeah.
And this is a movie that takes the human condition as its subject. And sort of squeezes this metaphor of shrinking for all it's worth. It reminds me of the Roger Corman movie X, the Man with X-Ray Eyes, where Ray Milland gets X-ray vision, and it starts off being like this fun little tee-hee thing where he's like, he can cheat at cards, and he can see through the gals' blouses. And then eventually, like, he can't stop, and he just keeps seeing deeper and deeper, and he sees, like, in people's bodies, and all he sees is just, like, sickness and illness and cancer around him. And then at a certain point, like, it climaxes, his eyes explode because he sees into the cosmos, and it's like this Lovecraftian sort of like terror that his sense of scale has changed so wildly that his idea of humanity has been like sort of crushed out of him by this new context. And this is the like Zen Buddhist version of that, where the main character in The Incredible Shrinking Man sort of learns to abandon all of these things.
It's definitely Zen Buddhist kind of. It's the best way to look at it.
There's a certain point where he's trying like figure out how the hell am I going to get my wife and my brother to notice that I'm down here. And he abandons all of his human concerns once he gets to a certain size. Yeah. He's like, those don't concern me anymore. I have no suffering because I have no desires.
Yeah.
So it's a really cool movie. And also like the special effects are great. All of those sets where it's just like, there's just a giant dime that he's running past and that sort of thing. I think all of those are really good. It's the kind of thing that had been done before, and I think Dr. Cyclops is a Paramount movie. I forget, but it's like from the late 30s or early 40s, where this like mad scientist shrinks a bunch of people down, and they have to run around these like giant size sets. This tops all of those kinds of movies that came before it in terms of just pure special effects.
When I was a kid, I always wanted the ability to shrink at will, so I could be action figure size and play with my action figures, like play sets and stuff. So I remember seeing this and not, being very young and just like seeing him living in a dollhouse and being like, wow, that's the life. Living in a dollhouse. I didn't think about plumbing, I guess. This is Universal, right? This is Universal?
Yes, Universal. The studio at the time was called Universal International.
So does that mean that the spider and the cat are Universal monsters? You're the expert here.
Sadly, the last Universal monster movie was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and nothing that comes after. Even Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, I consider a false.
Yeah.
Creature from the Black Lagoon gets included in those box sets. That to me is a different era. That's a different sensibility. It's a different thing.
Okay.
If it wasn't mashed in House of Dracula or House of Frankenstein, then it's not a Universal. Well, no, because the Mummy wasn't in any of those movies. But I think the shark in Jaws is also not a Universal monster.
And I guess neither is the Deadly Mantis, because I'm pretty sure that was also Universal.
No one's like, the Universal monsters, like Bride of Frankenstein and the T-Rex from Jurassic Park.
Yeah, yeah. I bet there is someone who does that, though. I bet you there's some really pedantic asshole out there who that's the thing he keeps trying to involve everybody in conversations at parties. He's like,
I like how much we hate him because we're different. We're slightly different brands of pedantic asshole.
We're better than him.
Yeah. His podcast isn't nearly as good as this podcast.
It's this pedantic asshole podcast. The concept of this podcast is not pedantic, except for that it is.
Yeah. Nitpicking about genre limitations is very pedantic.
Yes. The difference is that I enjoy the idea of different points of view on.
Yeah.
I like that part. I like that you don't consider them universal monsters and that it's actually not that important to me. So maybe I will just consider the Deadly Mantis a universal monster. And
why not?
Yeah.
I'll tell you this. One criteria of universal monster was it in those little orange books that my elementary school library had.
Yeah.
It's like, well, Frankenstein and Dracula had those books, and so did the Deadly Mantis.
Yeah. Well, I get those little blind box guys that were the universal monsters. And I have them on the shelf next to a little same size Piccolo from Dragon Ball. So I guess that means he's also a universal monster.
An honorary universal monster.
Piccolo from Dragon Ball.
You know, the thing about Piccolo is it's a lot of code switching because I think the black community
yes, the black community. Yes, they
Piccolo
did.
is an honorary black man and also an honorary the only brother who's a universal monster.
He's like the what is the snow globe thing that connects all of those TV shows?
Yes. All identities pass through Piccolo from Dragon Ball Z.
Exactly.
From the Saint Elsewhere snow globe.
Yes. God, there's probably somebody could probably prove that Dragon Ball takes place in that snow globe. So
yeah,
it
had that one newspaper headline that is like one of the key things that connects all of them. Yeah. Is all these TV shows using the same newspaper prop. Anyway, I don't have a lot more to say about The Incredible Shrinking Man.
I don't know. It's a good movie that's well made and that people like, and that it almost doesn't belong here just because it's such a thoughtful, normal film.
I mean, I will say that we're 3 films into this podcast. So far, we have Ray Harryhausen, honorary Academy Award winner. Roger Corman, honorary Academy Award winner.
Yeah.
And Jack Arnold, Academy Award nominee.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
So there's a bit more prestige in this subgenre than I think people will give it credit for.
I think we're about to lose some of that, but
yep.
It's not necessarily their fault.
The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences never gave Kurt Newman his due.
Well, okay, so let's move on to Kronos by Kurt Newman. This one, I'll say right off the bat, this was the first one I watched that I hadn't seen that I went, hey, I actually like this. I think this is a neat movie. I think this is this is a cool, it's moody, it's bleak. And I know you're not a fan, but and I also don't want to hype people up too much, but I think it is a sort of The Day the Earth Stood Still adjacent kind of picture. It has a lot of the same ideas that has and the same ways of going about things. It's a very anti-war movie, and which is not something that's going to come up very often.
I'd like to hear more about that because that was not something I got from it.
Well, I think that that's the way that I think that in the case of The Day the Earth Stood Still, it's aliens warning us that they will have to do something to stop us if we keep doing the bad things. This is the version where aliens are like, oh shit, they're doing the bad things. Let's take advantage of this and use our weird robot to absorb all the bad things. But I also think a lot of it's
should be noted,
the tone.
Both this and The Day the Earth Stood Still released by 20th Century Fox.
They also are both the thing that really works in this film's favor is the style. And I think they have a similar overall style. And I think they reuse some of that film. Yeah, they reuse some of the film's props. The Day the Earth Stood Still has some props show up in this movie. I don't know which ones they are. The production design here is super slick, and it's retrofuturistic, but it's also Art Deco chic to the point where it's almost abstract. And I think the best comparison here is the Batman the Animated Series. The giant robot here, the monster here is a giant robot, but it's not a robot in the sense that it's not a mech or even a Robbie the Robot. It's pretty abstract. It's basically a square that walks. And
It's like if you were trying to break down a icon of what like a human body into like geometric shapes.
Yeah.
This would be one place you could arrive. So it's like sort of a figure of a man in that you can see a head and legs.
Yeah.
But also very distorted and again, yeah, Art Deco is a good point of comparison.
this looks like something that the Justice League would fight on the Bruce Timm designed Justice League show. The IMDb claims that the robot was the inspiration behind the robots in The Incredibles. And that makes sense given that Brad Bird likes this B sci-fi era stuff, but I don't see it personally. I think if anything, it looks more like the Iron Giant than any of the robots in The Incredibles.
As long as we're throwing out comparisons, one of my notes here is it's no wonder that Gabe likes this. This feels like The Mysterians. This feels like a Japanese giant monster movie.
It does. It feels like I did this just popped up, but it feels like an American group of Americans reacting to a Japanese monster. Like it's so alien to them, and that's part of its appeal. Is it's so alien. It's not a giant insect. It's not a giant man. It's not a giant lizard creature. It's a cube. It's just really neat, and it's so bleak because it absorbs energy, and I think it's the first one of these that's genuinely apocalyptic. If this thing is let loose, it's going to bring about the end of the world, and they really need to do something about it. And there is a point where they shoot nukes at it, and that's exactly what it wants, which is, I'm sure that trope existed before, but it definitely became a thing more in modern science fiction and monster movies and stuff where that you're just making it stronger by giving it your strongest weapon. I'm sure it existed before this, but I had never seen that in a movie this early.
I haven't mentioned it yet, but something that I did immediately before preparing for this episode is go to a 24-hour Showa-era Godzilla marathon.
Yeah.
So I saw like the first 10, 12 Godzilla movies in a row chronologically. So it's a little mixed up in my mind, but in the first Godzilla, is there a scene where they're debating whether or not to use an H-bomb against it?
Yeah, and then they do say they decide not to because they think it would make it stronger, if I remember correctly. It's definitely less. I mean, it is an anti-war thing. I think the message is more just to be this sort of dread where nothing we have can do anything against it, which is like, that's like Independence Day and Mars Attacks are the same thing where like none of our weapons work. We need to find. Well, okay. It all goes back to War of the Worlds where none of the weapons we have do shit, and it's just germs that happen to help us, I suppose. Yeah,
and the something that my partner noticed while I was watching this, and they were in the room, their theory was that the look of the Kronos, the giant robot, was inspired by like Soviet brutalist architecture. And so earlier in this episode, when I said like there's something very specifically Soviet coded about Kronos, that's specifically is like if you want to take Kronos to represent the power of the Soviets during the Cold War, like it looks like a wild sort of abstracted version of all of the things that we are told about Soviet culture at that time.
Right.
Where it's just like brutal and bleak and anti-human, and it's all just like really dark colors and hard harsh angles, and there's no beauty to it.
Yeah.
The thing that I think about with most Japanese giant monster movies, which I've seen a fair number of, but not all of them, is that like the American giant monster movies are really preoccupied with biology. They're like, well, how did it get this big? What's the science behind it? What is going on in it? How do we destroy this biological thing? It is about like this gross, goopy monster. It is about like the close-up of the face in Attack of the Crab Monsters, or like just the like really disgusting biology of the deadly mantis or the black scorpion. And in Japan, it is the giant monsters are a little bit more mythical and more abstracted, and you don't actually like have a good sense of like the biology of so many of the monsters in the Godzilla series. Like why is Gigan like that? Why would who would make a Gigan? Why a Gigan?
Yeah.
It's like, because it's a crazy comic book thing, because it's all about the design and it's not about like the material reality of it. And that's the way that Kronos reminds me. One of the ways Kronos reminds me of the Japanese monster movies is that it removes the biological from the equation. There's one other movie that we'll be talking about that very notably removes the biological from the equation. I find that interesting. Also, just the scene where it's attacking like the Mexican power plant is just like, there are like 5 Godzilla movies that have this scene in it.
Yeah. This is a point where I started to really note the use of stock footage in these, and I think this is a case of some particularly well integrated and well thought out stock footage. Most of it's some sort of army propaganda and real bomb test footage, but they also took some shots from the 1956 movie The Revolt of Mimi Stover, where they weren't able to afford have this one takes place in Mexico for the most part. They eventually end up in Phoenix, Arizona, and the climax is in LA, but it's mostly in Mexico, and there's shots of Mexicans running away. And if you look closely, they're clearly Hawaiians and tourists wearing Hawaiian T-shirts, not Mexicans, because that was the movie they had that they could take the footage from, was a movie where Hawaiians are running away from something. But
the other thing I find really compelling about this movie is that its use of stock footage and its use of like double exposures and dissolves and things like that, and the way it manipulates stock footage, it's like borderline psychedelic. There is a scene where there is a mushroom cloud that gets played in reverse.
Yeah,
that is almost reminiscent of like the famous passage from Slaughterhouse-Five where Kurt Vonnegut talks about seeing war in reverse and seeing like bombs reform, and then all of the dangerous materials in the bombs go back into the ground and where they can't hurt anyone. Like, there's something like really poignant about seeing a mushroom cloud sort of get like schlooped back into nothing. And then like, so that's really interesting and sort of meaningful. And then some of it's just like really cool, where like, this is also a body snatcher movie.
This is another one that eluded Jim and I, because I'd never heard it referred to as such. But it is.
And there's a sequence where the alien entity is leaving the scientist whose body it's jumped into, and the way it does is like this illuminated liquid that starts like pooling out of his ears, but like the physics and the gravity of it coming out of him it's almost like it's operating on a different gravity, or it's like a liquid that's alive, like almost like a T-1000 sort of a thing. There's one shot in particular I'm like, this is awesome. This is so cool. And there's a lot of moments here and there where the special effects are not Ray Harryhausen dazzling like works of art. Like, Kronos has little feet that are just like drawn.
They're cell animated. It's actually really I'm sure that's another reason why I was connecting it to Batman. But they're cell animated, which I think is really beautiful in a weird way.
But also a little bit silly, looking or whatever. But then there's like, but some of just the double exposures and the use of stock footage and like clouds and flashing lights, double projected over people's faces and stuff. It's like, it's very expressive and free in a way. Again, we talk about these movies being dry. We talk about these movies being literal. We talk about these movies being like very square. Like, this is a movie that, despite the plot being all of those things, the visuals of the movie are a lot more imaginative.
I have my note for the thing you're describing is ectoplasmic mercury. It looks like you see the idea, the photos of people barfing up ectoplasm because they're being part of a seance. It looks like that.
Yeah, that spiritualist era. Some of those like edited photos of the ectoplasm and stuff. That's exactly what it looks like.
I also, when you're talking about the artistry of it, it has some really nice matte paintings of destruction. Just really, really nice looking stuff. I really like a good matte painting. There's something that comes up in one of the worst of the movies we watched, The Land Unknown, has some really nice matte paintings that almost make me like the rest of the movie.
I'll go as far as saying The Land Unknown is worth existing for those matte paintings.
Yeah, gorgeous stuff. I love that way that some matte paintings look like a painting. They don't look realistic, but
Yeah.
it's something I almost wish that cheaper modern movies, I feel like you don't have the budget to do realistic science, CG backgrounds, make them look unrealistic in an interesting way is like a better idea than failing to make them look realistic.
I mean, I think that is, a common complaint about like the Disney CGI house style.
Yeah.
Is like they're just too fucking detailed and too concerned with photorealism, and there's no imagination, and they're just hideous looking because of it.
Yeah. I don't know the episode in particular, but this is in the trivia section. This is connected to the plot of an episode of original Star Trek called The Doomsday Machine. But I also noticed that this is very similar to the way the evil Kryptonians try to terraform Earth in Man of Steel. Speaking of a lot of CG going on, though, like one of the few things that is striking about the movie Man of Steel is these huge machines that are sucking and dropping and sucking up and dropping massive amounts of buildings and people and stuff. And I don't know if I think of Zack Snyder as I know he's a very literate guy, but I don't know if I think of him as someone who watches old movies. But there was a sort of connection there that I appreciated. And then because I keep bringing in comic book stuff, I think that this also reminds me of Galactus from the Marvel comics, the sort of world-eating cosmic god. Galactus looks like a human with a weird hat, but there's just something about that level of cosmic entity that we cannot stop and that will just eat the planet. So this is another one of those things I'm like, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, were they aware of this movie when they wrote this thing? And it just kind of came to me.
It all feels like stuff that's sort of in the ether.
In the ether, in the a miasma of ideas. And this one is another one where it is slightly critical of the U.S. Army. It's not like Godzilla critical, but like the A-bombs are their fault, and that it takes place in Mexico, so everything that's happening is happening in Mexico, where the Mexican government it's a kind of interesting thing because we think of a lot of conservative media in particular being really portraying Mexico and Mexicans as a certain way, when in the 50s there was a lot of outreach between the United States and Latin America. There was that whole series of not very good Disney films with the Three Caballeros and stuff. There was just like there was a way. So the Mexicans are just another government in this. They're not podunk or anything like that. So there is a certain degree of us making their problem worse with what we're doing. It's not quite that critical, but I did think it was kind of, there's a little, just a touch of it, just because again, it just feels like a movie that's more aware of the dangers of what's happening.
I will say the downside is once you have set up like impossible, how do we defeat this thing? It's very hard to come up with a satisfying ending.
Yeah.
And like Godzilla does it by like tying it into characters, and like the one character has a secret and like has a reason to keep things a secret, and their feelings about this thing they've invented are conflicted and built on their trauma from World War II. Mm-hmm. And there's like a lot of character dynamics happening that make the oxygen destroyer in Godzilla like a compelling MacGuffin. Mm-hmm. Kronos is just sort of like, well, what if we scienced it? And they're like, sciencing it worked, and then the movie ended.
Yeah.
There's one character who literally just goes, well, I'm going to the movies, while the giant fucking alien machine that was threatening the Earth is still in the middle of collapsing. He's like, all right, done with Kronos.
Yeah.
He's turning away from like one of the most he's a scientist. He's turning away from one of the most awe-inspiring things ever, because he is so done. Like, the movie's so done.
Yeah. Yeah. It was actually something.
It's a very unsatisfying ending.
Christine found almost all these endings unsatisfying because they all end so quickly, and that one was one that she was particularly bothered by.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly true of. I mean, 20 million miles to Earth. It's like that's the King Kong climax. It doesn't have the iconic imagery of a King Kong climax, but it at least feels like the Coliseum is an appropriate place to end it. Attack of the Crab Monster is very sudden. Yeah. Incredible Shrinking Man, I think, is a satisfying ending.
Yeah.
But looking through these, a lot of these are just sort of like, how do we do it? And someone goes, what about this? And it's like, that worked. Goodbye. You stay in the theater. There's another movie playing.
Yeah.
We have to get out.
We also didn't say Newman, the director. He was, I guess he mostly did Tarzan movies and westerns, but his legacy is probably the 1958 movie The Fly, the original Fly, which is another movie that's misremembered as this sort of tacky, schlocky movie that's actually a pretty genuinely good movie, I think. It's not as good as some of the movies we've been talking about, but it's a pretty good movie.
I have to confess, even as a giant Vincent Price fan, not a fan of The Fly.
I like The Fly. I like Return of the Fly as well, but he didn't do that one, so I'm not talking about that. And then the note on the cast this time is that I think that this cast does a good job of mixing that corny, kind of smug thing that they do in a lot of these movies, but they're also like believably can say some of this really mumbo jumbo-y dialogue, and they have this sardonic wit that writers really like to try to put in these things, and in the bad ones it comes across as so shitty and smug and worthless and just characters who don't care about anything. But I do like it in this one, and as a matter of fact, one of my favorite things that happens watching, B movies, horror movies, sci-fi movies, is that I used to be really into the like golden age of 90s rock music, where they put like Rob Zombie would put a million different sound clips in, and then as years later you recognize the sound clips when you're watching a movie. And this one had one of those. There's 2 clips from Kronos that are in the Manor Astroman song Planet Collision, and I actually have heard that song so many times that I recognized actor George Hanlon's voice, or Jeff Morrow and George Hanlon's voice, talking to each other before they even got to the quote itself.
I feel like the one last thing I want to say about this movie is that it has a little bit of the Attack of the Crab Monsters energy, where there's a lot of plot elements that are bizarre. Mm-hmm. And you're like, for example, there is a supercomputer named Susie. Now, what does Susie stand for? Susie stands for Synchro Unifying Sinometric Integrating Equitensor.
Yeah.
So it is less explicable when you find out what it stands for than just it being a robot named Susie. But there is this supercomputer that's the size of a room named Susie that one of the scientists is trying to fuck. Yeah. And it's a very weird, superfluous element of the movie. That it kind of talks like a Coney Island R2-D2, where it's all bleeps and bloops, but instead of sounding like technology, it kind of sounds like bells ringing.
Yeah.
It's very weird. The body snatcher thing is also an element that this movie didn't need, but just adds. And like once you get to the end of the plot, you look back and you're like, wait, why was any of that in this movie? Yeah. That didn't seem to really play much of a point in the story. It opens with like a scene of brutal violence where some guy gets fucking wrecked with a pipe. Yeah. So there's a little bit of the energy of like, okay, Kronos, I don't know what you're going to throw at me next. You got weird ectoplasm coming out this guy's ears. You got a atomic blast looping back into its original form. It's like it kind of goes all over the place in a way that's like, I don't know if any of the individual elements are like really well thought out and achieved, but it's got a bit of a shaggy energy and a truly unique giant monster at its center that it's definitely worth seeing.
I have 2 cast notes, and one is that this is the first female lead. She's Barbara Lawrence. She is a scientist, or at least an assistant. I don't know if they specify, but she has scientific skill. But she actually has some romantic chemistry with the guy, and their big feminist victory moment is that she asks him to marry her at the end of the movie, and then deflects the question when he jokingly asks if she can cook. So this is like, so far, this is the highest standard of feminist representation in any of these movies. And then the second note is that the secondary male lead, Arnold, who's he's on the verge of being comic relief, but not quite. He's played by George O'Hanlon, who is best known as the voice of George Jetson. And once
interesting.
You read that, and there's still a little bit of movie left, you can kind of hear it when he gets frustrated. You hear a little "stop this crazy thing" sound in his voice, just a little bit.
So. Rosie, Susie, it's all coming together.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think of that. I mean, it is a sci-fi, so yeah, they're robots.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to bring this recording session to an end here. I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking that this is going to have been divided into 2 parts already. So this might end up being a 4-part series. We'll try to wrap it up in 3. We'll record the other part later. But we'll have a little more of an official goodbye for now here. Patrick, is there anything that you want to tell them to look for now, or you just want to wait till the last one?
Hey, if you like mid-century futurism, perhaps you would like our 96 Greers episode on Tomorrowland. If you like giant monsters, perhaps you would like our 96 Greers episode on Jurassic World. Possibly both of those are out now at the time you're hearing this. We are doing a series this summer called The Summer of Greer because in 2015, Judy Greer was in a bunch of high-profile movies playing very low-profile parts as the mom.
The mom. America's mom.
America's mom, Judy Greer. So we're covering Futureland, we're covering Jurassic World, we're covering Ant-Man, we're covering Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which is a 2014 movie, but still big summer hit with her.
Still a mom though. She's an ape.
Still a mom. That's right. So check us out, 96 Greers, part of the Now Playing Network. You can find 96 Greers at 96 Greers spelled out, so NINETYSIXGREERS.podbean.com.
And I'll think of something clever to outro for the next one, because I forgot that part and I'm kind of tired. So I'm just going to say goodbye and stay tuned for part 3.
Yeah, stay tuned for part 3.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
One asteroid, you've seen them all. Sure, to you, she's just a set of intercorrelated coordinates. What fun is that?